And next we have Lori Kim, who's going to talk to us about J.K. Rowling, giftedness, and the ghost of Ravenclaw.
So actually, I wanted to talk to you about, I cut down this talk from a 40-minute talk, and I cut out the entire part about Snape versus Lupin as teachers and their pedagogy. But I wanted to say, Snape is not a good teacher for the general population because he doesn't know how people learn. He is a good teacher for the gifted, which that's an option he exercises for his 6th year class. And Lupin is a terrible teacher for Hermione because he doesn't teach to the gifted, he teaches to the general population. 3rd year, Hermione learns nothing from Lupin. She fails the Boggart portion of her exam. The only thing she learns in Defense Against the Dark Arts is page 394. And he's a horrible person to her, but his level of teaching is appropriate for the gifted. And my conclusion to that is, I wonder if J.K. Rowling, as a student, was watching a really nasty teacher saying, why would somebody who hates teaching so much be a teacher? Maybe he's a spy and he's required to be a teacher, because why would, but that was something that I distinctly noticed when I was researching this talk on J.K. Rowling, giftedness, and the ghost of Ravenclaw. As many of us have noted, Ravenclaw is the most nebulously depicted of the houses. Are we blue and bronze? Are we blue and silver? Are we eagles or ravens? Are there any Ravenclaws in the Order of the Phoenix? It's almost as if, when it comes to Ravenclaws, there's an attitude of, who cares? When it's time for Harry to hunt Horcruxes, he can rattle off items with precision, except for the vague descriptor, something of Gryffindors or Ravenclaws. The other house artifacts are valuable and treated as such. The ring, the locket, the cup, and the sword are treasures, but the tiara is a piece of crap. It's described as battered and tarnished, shoved amongst mountains of garbage atop the bust of an ugly old warlock in a wig. After the books were finished, when Rowling started identifying the houses of more characters, do you remember the reader outcry against all the villains being Slytherins, and how, at some point, Rowling started to assign questionable or villainous characters to Ravenclaw instead? Lockhart, she said, was Ravenclaw, so were Trelawney, Ollivander, and Quirrell. There are people of exceptional aptitude in all houses. Ravenclaw is not necessarily for the most gifted, but for those who value their wit above all, and we can sense that this choice makes Rowling uneasy. The opening chapter of Sorcerer's Stone pits Dumbledore's management of giftedness against Voldemort's. When McGonagall says Dumbledore is the only one Voldemort was frightened of, Dumbledore replies, Voldemort has powers I will never have. And McGonagall says, only because you're too, noble to use them. Dumbledore deflects that compliment. Rowling is playing a truly long game of foreshadowing here. We will not find out why he doesn't think he deserves it until the end of the 7th book. Some other gifted people we hear about, Grindelwald, Quirrell, of whom Hagrid says, brilliant mind, he was fine while he was studying out of books, but then he took a year off to get some first-hand experience. Barty Crouch Sr., who speaks over 200 languages, authorized the use of the unforgivable curses against suspects and imprisoned people without trial. Snape, the imaginative but dodgy proto-Death Eater, who surpassed the author of his school textbook as a Potioneer. In all of these cases, these people's extraordinary powers forced them to confront moral issues beyond what most people deal with. Generally speaking, they did not always do well. Or, as Dumbledore put it, being, forgive me, rather cleverer than most men, my mistakes tend to be correspondingly huger. And in the midst of all these morally ambiguous gifted adults, we have Hermione Granger, whom Remus Lupin calls, nervously, the cleverest witch of your age I've ever met. The ambivalence starts with books and cleverness. First year, Hermione has just brilliantly gotten Harry through Snape's poison puzzle. She tells Harry he's a great wizard, he mumbles that he's not as good as she is, and then this 12-year-old girl disavows her gifts. Me, books, and cleverness, there are more important things. Friendship and bravery and... Did anyone else find that passage painfully self-effacing? Yes, heroism should be attainable for anyone, not just top students, but why did this author decide to put that message in the mouth of a character who derives enormous joy from books and cleverness? The one who Rowling, gifted writer and former head girl, acknowledged was based on herself at the same age. Rowling addresses the issue of Hermione's giftedness when Hermione invents the communications galleons for the DA. The others greet the coins with a blank silence. And Terry Boot, a Ravenclaw, demands to know why she isn't in Ravenclaw with her brains. She explains that the Sorting Hat almost put her there, but it decided on Gryffindor in the end. We can see why Hermione, who sets up an underground training camp because activism is much more important than homework, ended up in Gryffindor, but any attempt to understand why someone did or did not get sorted into Ravenclaw is impeded by the fact that Rowling, who is the queen of world building, is uncharacteristically muddled when it comes to this Hogwarts house. Hello, Ravenclaw, I see you there. Perhaps the purest embodiment of the potential creepiness of genius is Ollivander, who makes Harry shiver when he speaks reverently of Voldemort's evil powers as terrible, yes, but great. Ollivander says that the idea of the Dark Lord in possession of the Death Stick is, I must admit, formidable, reminding Harry that he had always been unsure of how much he liked Ollivander. Even now, having been tortured and imprisoned by Voldemort, the idea of the Dark Wizard in possession of this wand seemed to enthrall him as much as it repulsed him. But Ollivander also tells Harry he's sorry to say that he sold the wand that scarred him, so it's not that he's completely amoral. It's that he can simultaneously be moral and amoral, which is, I think, more chilling. We can't be certain whether he's going to have a conscience or immerse himself in value-free pursuit of pure knowledge. Maybe this is why people find us so creepy. The thing is, there is nothing about being able to appreciate pure knowledge that precludes our having consciences and strong morals. But looking at Quirrell, Ollivander, and Lockhart, it's clear that Rowling's Ravenclaws come pre-installed with intellectual curiosity, but morals or conscience are optional. Quirrell says he did once have ridiculous ideas about good and evil, but when he met Voldemort, he did change his mind to believe there is no good or evil, there's only power, and those too weak to seek it. Lacking conscience, but still brilliant, is how Rowling portrays Voldemort. Dumbledore tells Harry, never forget, though, that while his soul may be damaged beyond repair, his brain and his magical powers remain intact. No wonder I get the sense that Rowling mistrusts Ravenclaws. In a fandom where many readers are especially invested in the concept of the death of the author, which holds that stories must be understood without regard to the intentions or life circumstances of the author, it can be fraught to look to the author's life and psyche to shed light on how the text came to be the way it is. But for this topic, I decided to go there and see where it takes me, because in my view, Rowling demonstrates quite vividly that it is illuminating and rewarding to consider the author when engaging deeply with a piece of fiction. I'm going to mention a couple of instances that convinced me. Most iconically, Rowling packaged the Harry Potter stories with information about herself and her intentions. It's part of the story that she was a single mother, humbled to be struggling and dependent on assistance instead of making a splash as a writer the way she and others always expected of her. We know her grief over her mother's death informed all of the series, and that she longed to see and speak to her mother again as Harry longs for his lost family. She wanted us to know these things. I know I welcomed the way they enriched my understanding of the books, of her characters who rail against the burden of caregiving and then are ashamed of their ungraciousness. I am not sorry that this background informs my reading. I had wondered why Rowling chose to write James and Lily marrying and becoming parents so young. I stopped wondering when I learned that Rowling's parents had been that age when she was born. When I first read in Deathly Hallows that Snape had seen Lily's joyous ability to fly, I wasn't sure if Rowling meant that her character actually literally flew until I learned that her mother's maiden name was Anne Volant, the French word for flying. In a series that is so deliberate about the magic of names, and especially the names of mothers, learning the full name of the author's mother enriched my understanding in a way that I would never want to give back. The biggest gut punch came when I learned that Rowling's father is named Peter James Rowling. I resisted thinking about that for a while because it was too much. But I could not in any way make myself believe that this author in particular gave two major characters the same names as a family member by coincidence. I had wondered why James Potter was so difficult to find in this series. We get unflattering memories of him as a student, and we hear of his goodness as a young man, but when we see him as a father, he's barely there. When Voldemort kills him, unlike the complex view we get of Lily's death, James Potter fell like a marionette whose strings were cut. We get a much more vivid portrait of Peter Pettigrew, making me wonder if Rowling wrote different aspects of her view of her own father into these two characters, one despicable, one heroic but elusive. After making these connections, I could not help wondering if considering the author might also help me gain insight into the portrayal of Ravenclaw House and why it's so much more nebulous and ambivalent than the other three. With H.P. Cursed Child and Fantastic Beasts, this author has given us Gryffindor, Slytherin, and Hufflepuff points of view. She hasn't written a Ravenclaw story. What if it's Ravenclaw and not Slytherin that's her shadow house? The house of aspects about herself that frighten her or that she wants to repress. We meet the ghosts of Gryffindor, Slytherin, and Hufflepuff houses on Harry's first night at Hogwarts. 7 years and literally a million words later, on page 613 of Deathly Hallows, Harry runs after Nearly Headless Nick with this astonishing question: "Who's the ghost of Ravenclaw Tower?" I know some people like to rib Harry for times he's unobservant. In this case, I'm going to attribute this lacuna to the author and not the character. Nick points out a young woman with long hair, a ghost Harry had passed several times in the corridor, but to whom he had never spoken, who raises her eyebrows and drifts away through solid wall when she sees Harry looking at her. According to Rowling, she had written this ghost into the series twice before, but never identified her. Once in Harry's first year as the ghost of a tall witch, once in Harry's 6th year as the ghost of a long-haired woman, with no indication that they were meant to be the Grey Lady or even the same ghost both times. Page 613 of the final book is a supremely odd moment to be introducing a brand new character, the last one until the epilogue. Voldemort is already attacking Hogwarts. Is this really the time to be making introductions and wheedling information out of someone who's elusive even for a ghost? But Harry needs to find the Ravenclaw diadem, which Flitwick describes as long since lost. Nobody has seen it in living memory. The Grey Lady confesses with profound shame that she stole the diadem from her mother because I sought to make myself cleverer, more important than my mother. I ran away with it. I'm not sure Rowling intended this comparison, but we have found at last another force that outlasts death, just as love does: guilt. She has been so ashamed about something she did centuries ago that she cannot rest in peace. She confesses to Harry that she told Voldemort where to find the diadem. He was flattering. He seemed to understand, to sympathize. Even as a ghost, she craved relief from this guilt. Could it be that the author identifies with the Grey Lady, hating that she had once thought herself, with her intellectual promise, cleverer and more important than her mother? At the end of Book 7, is the author, like Book 1 Hermione, disavowing books and cleverness in favor of greater things? I almost think that's a stretch, but I find it hard to dismiss entirely, especially when we learn that Helena Ravenclaw was attacked by a possessive would-be lover. The consideration that makes it most difficult for me to dismiss is the intense sense of shame and ambivalence around this part of the story, long past the point in the plot when we expect a whole new development to interrupt the momentum of a thunderous finale. When Harry hears the Grey Lady's story, he thinks, here at last was a secret he and Voldemort knew that Dumbledore had never discovered. The battered, tarnished old diadem is shoved into the cathedral-sized city of unwanted garbage, the collective guilt of centuries, and the Grey Lady stammers and whispers her shame to Harry in bitter and defensive tones, her urge to confess struggling against her cold desire to keep her shame secret. And the author, who had regrets about her late mother and had once survived domestic violence, showed, I think, enormous ambivalence and reluctance in being unable to finish her cathartic epic without blurting out at the very last moment that she had written a faint trace of a long ago past version of herself into the books, although she had only been able to bring herself to write this ghost twice, nameless and voiceless and nearly invisible, as if the author herself had felt too ashamed to show this part of herself to Dumbledore, but had only been able to confess it to Voldemort and then shoved it into the room of requirement like something dark or broken. Rowling's saga was almost over. She was running out of Horcruxes. Harry, Dumbledore, and Ron had already had the opportunity to destroy a Horcrux and confront something in themselves. Another two were reserved for Hermione and Neville. Who kills Ravenclaw's diadem? Maybe if the author hurried and dragged a part of herself out of its obscure hiding place, a part she could barely think about and couldn't even always articulate in fantasy, there was still time for Harry to help her destroy a Horcrux and face something of her own. Here's how that Horcrux dies. A blood-like substance, dark and tarry, seemed to be leaking from the diadem. Suddenly, Harry felt the thing vibrate violently, then break apart in his hands. And as it did so, he thought he heard the faintest, most distant scream of pain, echoing not from the grounds of the castle, but from the thing that had just fragmented in his fingers. I hope this brought Rowling some peace. Dumbledore takes up the story from here, talking to Harry from the afterlife about the damage he caused by seeking to set his clever self above being a caregiver for his loved ones. You cannot despise me more than I despise myself. But I don't despise you. Then you should. I resented it, Harry. I was gifted. I was brilliant. I wanted to escape. I wanted to shine. I wanted glory. I loved my parents. I loved my brother and sister, but I was selfish. Trapped and wasted, I thought. And then, of course, he came, Grindelwald. You cannot imagine how his ideas caught me, Harry, inflamed me. Master of Death, which we took to mean invincible. After the death of Ariana, Dumbledore refused the post of Minister of Magic. I had proven as a very young man that power was my weakness and my temptation. I was safer at Hogwarts. I think I was a good teacher. That's such an understatement, it's almost funny. Of course, Dumbledore was the greatest of teachers, but it wasn't the magic he most longed to cast. He didn't have the internal ability to limit his desire for power, so he had to establish teaching as a form of self-protection, a way to keep himself occupied away from power. He explained such defenses to Harry in his 6th year. You are protected, in short, by your ability to love, said Dumbledore loudly. The only protection that can possibly work against the lure of power like Voldemort's. Dumbledore was remembering his weakness for power when he deflected McGonagall's praise for being too noble to assume the same powers as Voldemort. Of course, Quirrell was wrong when he said, there is no good and evil, there's only power and those too weak to seek it. Harry said as much during the final battle, when Voldemort boasted that he had performed magic that Dumbledore himself never dreamed of. Oh, he dreamed of it, said Harry, but he knew more than you, knew enough not to do what you've done. You mean he was weak, screamed Voldemort. Too weak to dare, too weak to take what might have been his, what will be mine. No, he was cleverer than you, said Harry. A better wizard, a better man. Having once permitted his giftedness unchecked reign, having once put no limits and no protections on his ambition for invincible power, and then grieved endlessly for Ariana's death, as well as the fascism he encouraged in Grindelwald, Dumbledore limited his destructive power by building his genius into teaching, to spreading love and protection and gifts to others. I hope Rowling is at peace with the Ravenclaw aspect of herself. She did, after all, come to reign over the world with her giftedness, but I don't think she used it to set herself above others. I think she found ways to build her genius into the warmth of her children's stories and her work with Lumos and other foundations, spreading love and protection and gifts to others. Okay.